Hello, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're joining from. This is one of those days when our technology doesn't work, and so we have not been able to record this live when we are presenting it. But we are super excited to have this recording done. And our topic that we are presenting is overcoming limiting beliefs. Like many of you in the discussion, we felt like there are certain things that stop you from doing what you would love to do. And so the discussion is about how to overcome limiting beliefs. My name is Joanne Darroch, the team leader of Majesty Training Associates. And at Majesty, every last Thursday of the month, we have a personal development topic that we discuss. And this month, it has been about how to overcome limiting beliefs. If I pause and ask you, what could be your limiting beliefs? An example of limiting beliefs could be that I'm not good enough, I do not have what it takes, I'm a fake, or even some more common imposter syndromes, which just really tries to emphasize that there's something that holds you back from believing that you can do it, from believing that you can actually achieve your potential if those limiting beliefs prevent you from doing what you need to do or from taking actions. Yes, I prepared some few notes and let me use those notes to guide our discussion. And yeah, let me just share that up there. Yes, yeah, that is it. And so Wire and Dyer said they say that there is one grand lie that we are limited. The only limits we have are limits we believe in. So let that sink in. So sometimes when we believe we cannot do something, it's really in our mind, but not necessarily true. So it's very important that we are able to distill what is true and what is not true. So we have some definition here about limiting beliefs. Let me just see. This has gone scrolled so fast. Is that I can't change, or I'm not good enough, as an example. I can never be successful. People like me don't get opportunities. I can't change. I will try. I've failed. This one I'm not able to do. It's too difficult. I don't have what it takes. So all those thoughts and assumptions that you have in your mind in one way affect your opportunity or your capacity to be able to deliver or to act on things that could be important for your life. And the problem is if we don't really think about these limiting beliefs, then it can actually curtail your progress. And that's why this topic is very important for us. We like to introduce you to Stephen Covey's book on the 7 habits of highly effective people. When we're looking at this topic, we felt like, okay, if we related it to the 7 habits of highly effective people, perhaps we could in one way be able to see where does these limiting beliefs come from. And in Stephen's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he said that there are 4 dimensions of life that really govern what we do, what we say, and how we interact. And that is around security, guidance, wisdom, and power. So where does your security come from? Who do you listen to, or whom do you go to for guidance? And where does your wisdom, your understanding actually come from? And then the power for you to be able to influence others. So he talked about those 4 dimensions, and interestingly, also other elements that influence those four um, 4 fundamental dimensions of life. So let's just take a look at the 11 components, and we just look at, for example, the spouse. Sometimes the spouse could affect how you think or what you do, how you decide, or you rely on your spouse for giving you the security that you need. So what we're trying to say is that it depends on where you are centered sometimes. Maybe from the past when you were a child, what you believed in, or in the environment in which you find yourself. Sometimes those could have had an effect on you, and those could have in part contributed to the limiting beliefs that you have. So if we look, for example, at the spouse, the family, or money, work, possession, pleasure, friend, enemy, interestingly, yeah. So if you are so concerned about who your enemies are, that in a way can also affect your orientation. Church, yes, it's good to be spiritual, but if it's too much, maybe it can also affect and contribute actually to your limiting beliefs. Then self and principle, and we'll just go through those a bit more. So for example, we say, maybe let's just go through the definition of what we mean by those 4 fundamentals of life, and go through security, for example, where security represents your self-worth, your identity, your emotional courage, your self-esteem, and basic personal strength or lack of it. While guidance looks at the source of direction in life, where do you encompass yourself? What do you believe in? What directs you to be able to say this or do this or not actually be able to do? So the standard principles or the implicit criteria that govern moment to moment, your decision-making abilities, or that wisdom, your perspective of life, your sense of balance, your understanding of how the various principles interact with each other, and really wisdom which helps you be able to judge perhaps what is good and what is right. So where does that also come from? And then power. Power really is looking at the capacity to act, the strength and potency to accomplish certain things, and the vital energy that helps you to make choices and decisions. And so it includes the capacity to overcome deeply embedded habits and to cultivate higher or more effective ones. So those are the 4 fundamentals. But then we say it also depends on where you're centered. And that's how we introduce you to the 11 elements or components, if you like. So for example, if, for example, you are so spouse-centered, in your security, yes, you'll be having feelings, emotions that, yes, are from you, but then you could also have a high reliance on your spouse. And so the mood in which your spouse is can actually affect your being, because then your security comes from their validation of who you are and what you can be. So that is the aspect of security. If you go to guidance, for example, yes, you may decide few things, but if you're overly centered on a spouse, then what they decide or what they say you should do is what you perhaps essentially will do. And so if they don't say do this, then it means you will not be able to decide or do anything for you. So your guidance is coming really from their perspective. So you can imagine if you have maybe a spouse who is not so much in your best interest, or is not really looking out for you, then you can get disoriented and really have a sense of not believing or trusting in your own abilities, because you are heavily reliant on somebody else. Or wisdom, here we have that your life perspective surrounds things which may be positively or negatively influenced by your spouse or in your relationship. So again, where does your wisdom come from? What about power? Power to act may be limited by the weaknesses of your spouse. So for example, if you decide like, okay, if you're a couple and you decide, okay, we need to buy property, so who decides where should this property be and where should we live and all that? And if their decision-making abilities are not good, you may end up acquiring property in a place which is not very good or not really appropriate for you. But because the power or the decision-making capacity is so reliant on the spouse, then a wrong decision will be made, and you really are in a way powerless in coming up with that. So you really see that depending on where you're centered, where your centeredness comes from, it influences the way you act, or the way you act, the way you think, and the way you think, and the way you may relate to different people or different circumstances. So it's very important that we get to know where our centeredness is using those 11 elements. Let's also just look at an example of, I find it very interesting, the enemy centeredness. So if you're centered on the enemy, like saying that people perhaps are against you, don't wish you well and all that, and how that actually could affect you. So if you look at security, for example, that could be volatile because then you're thinking about what is the enemy thinking about me, or what is their next action and all that. And so every time you feel very insecure, and you're every time you're trying to look out of what are they up to, or what is he or she up to if it's an individual. So it keeps you in that state of wondering and not really being able to settle to do what you need to do. Your guidance also will be heavily dependent on the enemy's actions. So remember, you're always looking out to what are they doing. And so most of what you decide will be dependent on what are they doing, or what actions you perceive that they are actually taking. Wisdom certainly is distorted because you cannot live in the brains or thoughts or assumptions of your enemy, and so that could curtail the way you make decisions. And then when it comes to power, it's your power is limited because it could be more of being able to react or revenge and all that, and so the way how you live your life, and in part really how your belief system is affected because of over-reliance on certain components. So really the one center that we should all embrace for us to have and also overcome, not to have, sorry, to overcome our limiting beliefs is when we center our beliefs on principles. Principles, these are things that have been tested, things that are true, and not because we grew up, for example, thinking that we can't, and yet we can't because we were just brought up like that. And so having a principle-centeredness is what we are recommending in this discussion, so that everything that you do, you're able to weigh it against certain set of principles, values, beliefs that are truly backed up by yourself or by people who actually take you in a better regard. So principle-centeredness, if you look at security, for example, your security is based on correct principles that do not necessarily change, and that do not necessarily change, and so really make you have that set of balance. Guidance, you will be guided, you will be having a proper compass or moral compass, or let me say North Star, to guide you on what you want to do. So your guidance will, for example, you may be having set of values that you believe in, and maybe people whom you actually believe in because you found them to be very principled people. When it comes to wisdom, your judgment will encompass a broad spectrum of long-term consequences and reflects a wider balance and quiet assurance, and you will be able to see things differently, thus think differently, and be able to really relate to a given circumstance or a situation, and you're not necessarily affected by others. Then when it comes to power, you with principles, you self-aware and knowledgeable, and you'll be proactive in actually challenging some of those negative beliefs that you have. So we really believe that looking at these fundamentals of life, the security, the guidance, the wisdom, and the power, and how our centeredness could in one way have affected our belief system, is very important in overcoming limiting beliefs. So being able to reflect upon the limiting beliefs, whether they actually hold water or they are just assumptions or thoughts that were inbuilt perhaps in childhood or because of the environment that we find ourselves. So it's always good to have a principle-centered approach, because that is valid, that is factual, that is something that you can actually rely on. So in this discussion, the invitation is for you to reflect upon those limiting beliefs that you have. Yes, acknowledge them. Yes, it's okay to acknowledge. I believe I'm not good enough because of A, B, C, D, but then find out why. If I'm not good enough, why am I not good enough? Perhaps you have the qualifications, the experience, just like any other person. But why is it that for you, you feel that way? Maybe because of the centeredness in which you're coming from. It could have been friends, maybe the friends that you relate in, even while they are qualified, they are all feeling inferior because of certain centeredness where they are coming from. So it's always good to question those limiting beliefs and examine. I love this, examine the worst case scenario. Okay, if this limiting belief is really exists, okay, I believe if I try this thing, I would fail. So if I fail, what will happen? What is the worst case scenario of failing? Yeah, I like to give an example. Maybe the worst case scenario is what I'm going to do may it kill me, so that can be really worse. But if it still leaves me alive and then I'm able to breathe, that means I can actually do something. So really stretching that limiting belief and say, okay, what's the worst case scenario of if this limiting belief actually materializes? So then you begin to realize that, wait a minute, perhaps I'm just taking this too far. Yeah, so just that example of failure. Sometimes I like to personally, the failure thing, how I've tried to overcome it is just to say, you know what? Me, I'm experimenting, and in an experiment, you can either succeed or fail. So failure is, well, I just have realized or discovered one way in which something may not be able to go through. So having counter-reactive things that can help you counter those limiting beliefs. So yeah, so and part D of this saying, being able to reframe, like how I've just talked about failure, reframing and say failure is one way of me experiment. Failure is not really failure, but is one way of experimenting. So if I'm experimenting in an experiment, there's either I can either succeed or I can fail. So in that way, I don't mind, or I'm not so bothered about failing. Yeah, so you try to reframe those things that make you have those limiting beliefs, and then reframe so that limiting beliefs become something of the past. The other thing is also to look at some people whom perhaps you knew had some limiting beliefs, but they have been able to overcome, and find out how did they do that, and yeah, and let them act as your role models, and then really take actions on your limiting beliefs. First of all, being able to list them down, list them down, and then if you have somebody who has overcome them, then you can use them as the role model, but then interrogate further. What could the worst case scenario be? And yeah, and from there come up with actions of how you are actually going to overcome your limiting beliefs. So that's what we had for our Lunch and Learn this Thursday, and I really hope you picked something from there. And yeah, and so we invite you to join us for other future Lunch and Learns where we discuss different topics. Thank you. I've been Joan LaRocque, the team leader of Majesty Training Associates. Bye.